I've recently gotten really into true crime, as I'm sure a majority of you can relate. I work in a fairly tedious job. The only real benefit to the job is that I can just stay put and have my earbuds in all night. At first, I would just listen to music, but eventually, it started to feel like background noise and failed to stimulate my brain. So, I searched for more engaging content. A few audiobooks here and there, and some comedy podcasts where rich people talk to other rich people. Eventually, I landed on some true crime podcasts, as recommended to me by a few of my friends. Not that I had avoided true crime to that point. I've watched documentaries and the like, but boy, did the podcasts click right away. My work site isn't exactly well lit, and there are long stretches of time where I'm completely alone. So, something about listening to stories of these horrific cases sparked something. Maybe a survival instinct that made me more aware of my surroundings. I'd stare at buzzing screens with so little movement you'd think they were pictures, and I'd imagine some sketchy character chasing his next victim from screen to screen, which I'm aware is pretty morbid, but like I said, the job is boring, and when listening to that kind of content, your mind is going to wander. As far as which podcast I indulge in, I have quite a few of the popular ones on a steady rotation. Like the last podcast on the left and morbid. My favorite recently, though, is a bit less known. They have your expected episodes on the more well-known serial killers, but they also have an intimate knowledge of what is currently brewing within the dark alleys and moldy basements. That is to say, they look at current or recent investigations and hypothesize on whether or not there's a serial killer in the making. If a current crime spree is a part of a bigger picture or a coincidence of isolated events. It may not be as concrete as other podcasts, but there's an unknown to it. A what if? That is so tantalizing. I was listening to some older episodes, trying to catch up when my eyes drifted to the time, and it was rapidly approaching the end of my shift, which meant my weekend had arrived at last. With a heavy sigh, I pulled the earbuds out and placed them in their plastic coffin. I quickly jotted down the night's events for cross-reference should anything occur. Not that anyone would need to confirm what a raccoon was doing in the trash at 1:14 in the morning, but you never know. Now, I'm not always the best at taking advantage of my weekends. I wouldn't call myself a shut-in. I can be quite sociable, but I'm very content, I suppose. Staying home in a nice warm bed watching movies is a perfectly fine way to spend my time. My friends, though, like to go out, so I normally depend on them to get me out of the house. It's like a symbiotic relationship. So, I wasn't surprised when they invited me to the bar with them. I should say the bar, the same one we always go to. Sometimes it's the last stop of the night, sometimes it's the first, but we always end up there. Nice atmosphere, always just busy enough that it wasn't packed, but still enough traffic that it never felt dead. It was at that bar that night when my friend elbowed my side. I looked at him and he quickly gestured with his head. A silent bob of his head conducting my attention at the end of the bar. Turning my head, I saw her immediately. She was not bashful. A drink hung cautiously in her hand, fingertips threatening to lose their grip at any moment. Her eyes portrayed an alertness, but her eyelids told the story of someone with a drink or two already in their system. God, even the bar's lighting caressed her. With those stern and lazy eyes, she stared right back at me. It had been a while since I was romantically involved with anyone. Hell, it had been a while since the very idea of being romantically involved even crossed my mind. But I had already poured a few back myself, and besides, like I said, she was not being coy. I stood up and walked across the bar towards her. This is the part where you imagine fishermen. Can you see them? Their boat cresting over dark and ambiguous waves. Can you hear what they hear? The soft song in the night, drawing ever closer. Can you see her? The siren in the murk, her eyes glowing at the spell-drawn sailors, ready to show them just how deep the oceans really plunge. I could see her clear as day when I sat on the stool next to her. Her red lips were a song all on their own, and as she spoke, I knew it was sweet. Her words were pronounced and silky, every one of them spilled out with just enough rasp to keep your hook. A strand of brown hair loosened from behind her ears and fell gently in front of her face. She let it sit there, and she kept her eyes on me through the curtain. She was exquisite, almost to a manufactured degree. I could nearly feel her claws digging into my brain, massaging away any cautious thoughts. So, before I go any further and I make myself look stupid, if you were there on that boat with me, and you heard her song, I feared you'd suffer a similar fate. We talked for a while. Her name was Macy. She was smart and witty and knew when to press into a topic more and when to back off. A few hours later, my friend tapped me on the shoulder. I had stopped drinking when I started talking to her. This inadvertently designated me as the night's designated driver, and so I began to say my farewells and rise from my seat. Before I left, she pulled out her phone. The phone's dim light shined on her face, the soft blue contrasting with her lipstick. She took a moment scrolling through before beginning to jot her number down on a nearby napkin. She then held her hand out and handed the napkin over. A quaint smile plastered on her face. "See you soon," she spoke, a stalwart promise. Time went on as it always does. The napkin with her number on it remained on my nightstand for the next few days. I can't explain it, but it had been a while since I had done anything relationship adjacent, and I wasn't sure about the etiquette. But I was about to start my work week and figured it couldn't hurt to send her a message at least. So I did, short and to the point. A few droll hours went by, podcast ringing in my ear when my phone vibrated. It was her, Macy. Opening the message felt intimidating, as if she was sitting right next to me, waiting for me to read it. But her reply was brief as well, easy to reply to. Back and forth throughout the night, we texted each other. I was surprised that she was up when I sent the message. I had done so under the rationale that she would be sleeping and wouldn't respond till morning. We mostly jested and offered vague details about our lives. Real softball stuff. My eyes flickered from screen to screen and then back to my phone. It was during this that the podcast in my ear went silent. The one about brewing serial killers. Normally, it would jump to the next episode, but to my dismay, I had caught up with their latest releases. Unfortunate for sure, but there were still quite a few episodes I had skipped, so easy enough to go back and listen to them. Electing an older episode, I mentally switched over to my conversation with Macy. I had just told her what I did for work and asked her the same, to which she replies that she was between jobs, which completed the picture of why she might have been sitting at the bar, as I had found myself in that position before. The Portland Mantis. The podcast host began to ring in my ear. Hearing this caused the hairs on my arm to stand up. Something about sitting alone in a room watching static security cameras, while listening to the true crime podcast say the name of the city you live in. Sure, it's a bit creepy. In a good way, though, the kind of chills that make me suddenly very good at my job. By the time this episode started up, though, my shift was ending. And so, I signed off on all the non-incidents for the night, and once the next guy arrived, I took off. I was excited. Between all the chit-chat, I made dinner plans with Macy. It wasn't easy or optimal, but I'd have enough time to squeeze in a quick date before going back to work. It was a simple date. One of those restaurants that is sitting between fast food and fine dining. Even if the bill could have convinced you we were at the latter. The date was smooth. Simple conversation, apart from the awkward silence that always arrives when you're eating. She told me she had lived in Portland her whole life, and that she would probably die here too. There was a gloominess to the way she spoke. Not sad. Just the things she said were an inch darker than expected. Just enough to pick up on over time. We all have quirks, though, and I brushed it off whenever I noticed. Like she said, she didn't have many friends, and the ones she did have, she didn't know if she could even call them friends. Still, it was nice, and there was a chemistry between us, and the way she looked at me. Her eyes were silk. Her lips were velvet. She was stunning, and time flew by when I watched her. Before I knew it, I had blinked, and I was back at work again. For a few hours, I was replaying the date in my head, listening to the same songs I had listened to 1,000 times before. As I was daydreaming, my brain rang the alarm bell as something shifted in my peripheral. On one camera, there was a rare spot of movement. The building was old and slated to be condemned, so I see vagrants from time to time, but they normally just stumble right into the frame. I sat, more alert than I had been on the job for weeks, and stared at what was now a dark shadow on the screen. Most of it was resting out of frame, dark silhouette hanging in the corner. It was like one of those ghost photos that go viral, one you look at and immediately think is fake. Noting it down, I grabbed my flashlight and lifted off the chair. It was time to make my rounds anyway. It shouldn't be a surprise, but by the time I could beeline it to the obstruction, there was nothing to be found. I located the camera's position and tried to imagine its angle and what would have to stand there to cast that ominous shadow. It felt strange standing there, the light voices of my music still drifting from the earbuds that rested temporarily in my coat pocket. The sensation of being watched. But I was able to convince myself a beetle or something had just clung onto the camera and finished my rounds. Upon returning to the security room, I decided I needed something more engaging and put the podcast on. The Portland Mantis. An alarmingly local and still fresh case with a murderer yet to be labeled as a serial killer but not for lack of effort. My mind grasped onto the podcast. They opened as usual, stating that they are not professionals or law enforcement and that their opinions should be treated accordingly. Just opinions. They then whisked me away, pulling me into the depravity and destruction that was the Portland Mantis. Obviously, they didn't know who she was. They only followed various cases in the area and made connections where they could. Even they admit that a great deal of their episodes likely aren't accurate. Just again, opinions. Though with the Portland Mantis, there was a strong connection between the cases. All the victims were found in a stranger's home, often being discovered by the family, who would be away at the time of the killing. The victim's body would be found in the primary bedroom, sheets soaked to saturation in their blood, while the damage inflicted on the bodies varied. Injuries ranged from stab wounds to burns and exposure to acidic compounds. There was always the mantis calling card. Someone would crudely sever the victim's head from their body. The cuts were never clean. Instead, the skin on the neck would be jagged and torn, strips hanging at different lengths. The spine would be nicked and cracked as if the individual struggled to get through the bone, or possibly, they enjoyed the savagery. They described it much better than me. The scene was laid out before me like a painting, one I couldn't stop looking at. I imagined coming home after a vacation to find someone's body left like that on my bed, sometimes sitting there for days. The smell that must produce. How do you ever wipe that from your memory? I listened for a good hour or so, the two hosts theorizing on the motives, the possible appearance of the killer and detailing how police have handled the cases so far. It should have been a sign that Macy messaged me. I know it's easy to read this and scream at me for not making the connection. But really, what are the odds? As I stared down at her message asking me to get drinks on the weekend. Seriously, what are the odds? They're astronomical, right? Coincidences like this only play out on movie screens. But it played out all the same. We continued talking through the week about how much we looked forward to hanging out again. It made the week fly by. I'd watch cameras for hours and listen to horror stories about the Portland Mantis until even that ran out of content. And by the weekend, it had just become another episode shuffled into my memories. Friday arrived before I knew it and everything about the mantis left me. Especially when I saw her again, dressed up like we were going somewhere fancy. We drank and talked, laughed, and before I knew it, my motor functions started to slow and my body felt light. And by the red on her cheeks, I'd say we were riding the same train. Finishing one last drink, she pulled her gaze to me and asked if I'd like to go to her place. Of course, obviously, I said yes. My inhibitions were altered, to say the least. I should have been more alert, but I was too focused on how the cool air felt on my skin as we walked up to her house. Such an ordinary home. All the windows had darkness resting behind them. It looks taller than it probably is in my memories. Maybe I should have been worried when I watched her fumble with the sedative. She was drunk though, and so was I. There have been nights when my lazy fingers couldn't find the right key. She tried each one, apologizing the whole time, as if each failed key was a great crime. Then she shifted her frame. I couldn't see the door handle anymore, and with a quick jerk, we heard the door click and she let out a sigh that evaporated in the air. The air inside was still undisturbed. I followed her around the house, moonlight being our guide. She motioned upstairs. Though trinkets and ornaments were scattered around, their presence was insignificant compared to the stunning scarlet dress she wore. Its vibrant color demanded my attention. The slit that let her thighs poke through at just the right gait. She excitedly proclaimed where we'd be sleeping as she swung open the wooden door to reveal a study. A room full of bookcases and a large oak desk. She must have seen my eyebrows raise, and with a quaint laugh and her admission of being hammered, I brushed it off. Another door swung open, and there was our bed. Larger than any I had ever owned, with a canopy over it. She laughed again, almost more excited than I was. She waltzed into the room and made a big display, showing it off. Her arms spread out and she spun, singing, "Here we are." I realized just then how badly I needed to pee. I had been holding it in and the house was freezing. When I told her I needed to use the bathroom, she looked puzzled. The moonlight caressing her face almost made her look angry. I didn't have time to think. Her vague down-the-hall instructions sent me rushing off. I was relieved to have chosen the right door initially, as someone had already opened 2 doors, leaving only 2. Relief spread over my body as I sat on the cold toilet seat. I looked over to the sink, and another small alarm bell rang. 3 toothbrushes were sitting on the sink. I started to look around the room as if I was trying to find the literal writing on the walls. An ancient sense of approaching danger kicked in, the sobering kind. My slouched frame straightened. The house we were in was so nice. A study, it had a study room. Macy said she was between jobs. My mind rationalized that it could be her folks' home, that maybe she had to move back in while she looked for work. It would explain a lot, other than how cold and stiff the air was. If she had just left to meet me at the bar, would it really have gotten so cold? Trying to push away my suspicions, I scrolled through like muscle memory took over. My fingers navigated to the podcast I had listened to last, despite having no intent on listening to it. The sound of liquid smacking against the porcelain toilet started to teeter out, and my eyes were locked on the screen. The Portland Mantis in my recently listened to queue. There was a sinking in my chest, a heaviness. Over the past week or so, I had been climbing a roller coaster, and only then, pants down and bladder empty, was I able to see the crest. I stood up, turned my phone off, and pulled my pants up. Walking briskly to the sink, I reached over and pressed on the toothbrushes. The bristles on each of them were dry and stiff, and used. Suddenly, like I was looking for the signs of a predator in the wild, everything was thrown into suspicion. The counter had a thin film of dust. The bottom of the bathtub was dry. Then I was moving quicker, following in rhythm with my heart. Carefully, I turned the bathroom light off and slowly opened the door. I was lucky, and the door didn't make a peep. Slinking through the frame and into the doorway, I could see the light pouring out of the primary bedroom. At the end of the hall, though, was a small table. On it were 2 vases, both adorning a collection of various flowers. The flowers were on either end, with a space in the middle that felt like something should be there. Opening the drawer under the table confirmed my suspicion. In my hands, the cold metal edge of a picture frame. Inside was a family photo. A mom, a dad, and a child were all smiling at some amusement park. My heart was beating so hard I thought the floorboards were pulsing. Macy is a very pale woman. The family in the photo had a glaring difference in skin tone. She called my name, her voice drifting out from the primary bedroom. I imagined the sailors. I imagined the waves and the song they heard. My fingers clenched around the edge of the picture frame, and I pulled, quickly setting the picture frame back into the drawer and sliding it shut. I had decided Macy had to be her, the Portland Mantis. She hadn't used her keys to unlock the front door. She obstructed my vision so she could pick it. She forgot which room was the bedroom. This wasn't her house. Turning around, I started walking towards my only way out. I had to pass by the door frame. As soon as I walked by, I planned to start sprinting. 911 was dialed, but I didn't want to risk my whispers carrying through the house. But just as I approached the soft amber light leaking out, she, like a phantom, stepped out of the doorway. Her body was wrapped in the glow. It danced around her edges until bleeding into darkness, all punctuated by that red dress she wore. It danced with the light as her fingers toyed with the lining where the fabric split at her thigh. "How long are you going to keep me waiting?" she says, and it sounded like the first words I'd ever truly heard her speak. Syllables that were just as red as the dress. Her hair hung over her face, wrapping her features in black. She moved her head to look at me, and all I could make out were eyes. They looked like they had embers burning in them. She hardly looked human, standing there, slightly hunched over, ready to move. She must have seen me take a step back. The first step back I had made since meeting her. And I couldn't exactly see it, but I could feel it. I could feel her face drop, and suddenly the house was that much colder. Her back straightened, and she looked so tall in the light, even as she delicately slipped out of the heels she had been wearing, kicking them to the side. I told her that I wasn't feeling well and that I was going to head out. There was a silence that felt like it lasted an eternity. Then a soft okay creeped out from her imposing frame. It sounded almost childlike, shy and defeated. Each step I took towards her felt harder to take. She just stood there watching me. Her hair dropped from one side to the other as she pivoted her gaze. She was all dark from my perspective as I made it to the doorway of the bedroom for a moment. Just a split second, I thought, what if I was wrong? I'm just accusing a drunk girl of being a serial killer for no reason. Peering past her for a moment, looking at the perfectly normal room, I almost didn't feel it going on my side. It wasn't until her knuckle gently tapped my side that I realized it had happened at all. She pulled back, and I could just barely see the syringe poking out between her clenched fists. "You don't like me?" she says, low and withdrawn. It all started to play out before me. I knew what was coming next. My finger had already been pressed to begin the 911 call. Before I could lift my arms up to push her away, like a shadow, her frame twisted, and she launched her fist into my ribs. She was strong, and it stung. With everything going on, I had forgotten that I still had quite a bit of alcohol in my system, and it made my body hard to control on the rebound. Adrenaline and booze were at war with each other. But as my body pressed to the wall, I heard the faint voice of the 911 operator in my ear. I started shouting, as briefly as I could, where and why I needed assistance. I didn't know the exact house number, but I knew the street and area well enough. She leaped forward like an animal instinct had taken over. I was able to push back, but I could already feel whatever she hit me with taking effect. I was already drunk, and whatever was in the syringe was compounding. Vision momentarily going blurry before snapping back into place. My body leaned the wrong way, and I started to stumble, falling further into the hall. One foot caught weirdly, and I went spiraling to the floor, elbow smacked hard against the wooden floor. A pain rang out through my body, culminating in a heat that rested in my spine. The scream I produced was guttural. "She's trying to kill me." I shuddered out. Spit was pooling in my mouth. Clawing at the floor, I tried to regain my composure. I could hear her footsteps, feel them vibrate through the wood. She was looming over me, the light still pouring out of the room, like an entrance to hell. Her foot pressed against my side and rolled me over until I was lying on my back. Alcohol and her cocktail waltzed through my bloodstream. Extremities were light and slow to react. Vision was blurring, and there was this swirling in my stomach, a thick mass of hot bile that threatened to invade my mouth at any moment. If I wasn't so scared, I'd have thrown up for sure. I just kept screaming into the phone, anything I could do to help get the police to me quicker. I hate how unbothered she was. The whole time I was describing her, I was telling the operator what was happening and where I was. She didn't move any quicker. She stalked towards me, a slow dance, her body swayed like a ghost. Felt like I was so beneath her. All the flattery, the flirting, and the longing stares all melted away. I could feel how pathetic she thought I was. Easy prey. That ghostly frame lowered. I crawled back as much as I could. All that great effort, the struggling, and the grit I felt from clenching my teeth, it only bought me a couple of seconds and a handful of inches. She was on top of me, and my body was on the verge of passing out. She was crouched over me, back hunched and eyes staring at me, unmoving. She held her arm up. I could see the dark outline of a knife clasped in her hands. A long and jagged blade, something you might use to carve a turkey. I thought about what the host had said, how unclean and cruel the beheadings were. The mantis was kind enough to give me a preview. Lowering her arm, she placed the knife to my left shoulder. With little effort, she raised her arm, letting the teeth of metal dig into my skin, unzipping me. It hurt. I couldn't express it, but it was warm and stinging, and each tooth somehow found a new nerve to pluck. I could feel it in my chest, though. I had one more good push left in me. Fear had drenched my every thought, but I just needed to find the right time. She lowered the knife again, this time letting my left thigh take a sample of her bloodlust. As it ripped through the fabric of my jeans and pierced until my thigh split open, I heard her exhale. A soft, almost loving release of air. Her hips moved slowly on mine. Then the knife was placed against the side of my neck. She'd have to be quick about that, getting through my neck before the cops came. As she started to pull up, and the moonlight caught her face, expression wrapped in ecstasy, I dug into my pocket and retrieved the metal bit I had torn from the picture frame. Adrenaline rushed in. I clenched my entire body, begging it to move for me. My arm lifted with hers. Each tooth on her blade pressed deeper and deeper. I slammed the torn metal in my hand into the soft flesh on her thigh, as hard as I could and as quick as I could, 3 times as she started to shift in response. My 4th stab went into her side, and I used it as leverage to start pushing her off of me. I was running on borrowed energy, a miracle I could move at all. Her body tumbled off mine. She barely put up a fight, though. Surely she could have overpowered me. But it felt like she accepted it, barely making any noise when the metal pierced her. No, she just watched, more animal than human. A specter in the hall, eyeing me as I scrambled towards the stairs. My heart was just about in my throat when I saw the red and blue lights flashing outside. I must have looked like a landlocked fish as my body jerked and chucked itself closer to the steps. There was no way I'd be able to stand long enough to walk down them. I was desperate to get as far away from her as I could, so I reached out to take the first step. Using the rest of my strength, I pulled myself over the edge, sending my body limp down the steps. The wooden stairs cracked and slammed against my body like fake teeth. When my body finally landed on the bottom of the steps, all I had left to do was scream as loud as I could. And boy did I. A wounded dog calling for its master. I howled through spit and blood. Up the steps, she stood, the red and blue lights cascading into the house, barely touching her. A dark frame loomed at the top of the steps, her gazing practically ripping my head off. Then, a loud thud as a stiff boot pressed against the front door. Like a bell had been rung. Her frame twisted at the top of the stairs and began drifting away. I yelled. I tried to warn them, but my words were slurred and clumsy. She vanished quickly, but I couldn't tell which room she ran into from my perspective. My vision was starting to tunnel, and I could tell I was fading. Trying to lift any part of my body yielded no results, and even my thoughts began to betray me. All I could feel was the cool, fresh air rushing in as the front door swung open. For a moment, my last moment in that house, I thought I saw her, hunched over me, eyes peering at me from within dark clumps of hair, watching me as I faded into unconsciousness. When I woke up, I quickly ran through the gambit of questioning. I gave them everything I could, and with every detail I relayed to them, I wondered which bits were real and which ones were lies. Was I the first to get away clean, and just because I had gotten a few seconds ahead of her by pure luck? She could have killed me, though. If she wanted me dead, I would be dead. But it wouldn't give her the satisfaction she wanted. I think I can only guess. Having to rush through her ritual, though, she wouldn't have gotten what she wanted out of it. The police followed up with me here and there. I even sent the podcast an email about my encounter, though I haven't heard from them. Doesn't look like they do follow-up episodes. My wounds are bandaged, and other than a few minor bone fractures, I made it out all right. The drugs made me feel sick for a day or two, but after that, I returned to work. My friends joked that my job was perfect. The best defense against a stalker is sitting in a room watching cameras all day. No one can sneak up on me at work, but I still feel it. When I'm making my rounds or my mind wanders a bit too astray from the cameras, I can feel her eyes. And what's worse, I always think about the shadow I had seen on the camera a few nights before meeting with her. It's a hard thing to forget. I see it all the time now,